The dust swirled like angry spirits around the makeshift auction block in Dry River Crossings Market Square. And Etta Mae Tully stood trembling at its center, her wedding dress the same one she'd worn 4 years ago, when hope still lived in her heart, now torn and stained with tears and desert grit. The jeers of the crowd cut deeper than the scorching wind that whipped her dark hair across her face. But it was the letter clutched in her trembling hand that truly terrified her. Half the price of a good steer. Her father bellowed, his voice thick with whiskey and desperation. Thomas Tully's gambling debts had finally caught up with him, and his daughter was the last asset he had left to trade. She's got strong hands for work, even if her womb's as barren as the salt flats. The crowd pressed closer, their faces twisted with the cruel fascination that drew people to witness another's complete destruction. Etta recognized most of them, the baker's wife, who'd once shared recipes, the blacksmith who'd shoed her horse, the preacher's daughter who'd been her closest friend before marriage. And failure had separated their paths forever. But it was the letter that made her situation truly desperate. Hidden in the folds of her torn skirt, the physician's report confirmed what she'd suspected for months. The consumption that had killed her mother was beginning its slow, inexorable work in her lungs as well. She was not just barren, she was dying. Slowly, perhaps, but certainly. What am I bid for damaged goods? Thomas Tully's voice cracked, and Etta saw him wipe his nose on his sleeve. Her own father selling her like livestock because his poker debts to Silas Kane, the territory's most dangerous loan shark, would cost him his life if unpaid by sunset. And a barren as a salt flat, spat Agnes Morrison from the crowd. What decent man would want such a cursed thing in his house? Etta's hand moved instinctively to the small scar hidden beneath her dress collar. The mark Fergus Voss had left during their last violent argument before his family cast her out. Even in her darkest moments, she'd never told anyone how their marriage had truly ended, how Fergus's rage at her barrenness had turned physical, how his mother had watched him strike her and done nothing to intervene. Do I hear $20? Her father's desperation was palpable now. The crowd was losing interest, beginning to drift toward the shade of the general store awning where the afternoon's real business would be conducted. That's when she saw him tall and silent at the edge of the square, his weathered hat pulled low over storm-gray eyes. Boone Fletcher. She'd heard whispers about him, the rancher whose wife had died birthing their 4th child 3 winters past, leaving him to raise the children alone, while his spread slowly failed from neglect and heartbreak. But there was something else in those whispers, something that made the decent women of Dry River Crossing lower their voices when his name was mentioned. Rumors about the mysterious death of the cattle rustlers who'd threatened his family last spring. Stories about the way men who crossed him tended to leave town suddenly, often in the middle of the night. Boone Fletcher stepped forward, and the crowd parted like water before him. There was something in his bearing that suggested he was accustomed to violence, comfortable with it, in a way that made even the boldest men step aside. 25. He said simply, his voice carrying the rough authority of a man who'd learned to command through action rather than words. "We're going once." Thomas Tully called out, relief evident in his voice. Etta felt a moment of wild rebellion surge through her. She was about to open her mouth to confess her consumption publicly rather than trick this stranger into taking home a dying woman, when a commotion erupted at the edge of the square. Silas Kane rode in with 3 of his men, their guns visible and their intent clear. The loan shark's pale eyes fixed on Thomas Tully with the cold precision of a snake selecting its prey. Tully Kane called out, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent square. "You've got 1 hour left on our agreement. I hope you're not planning to disappoint me again." The threat was unmistakable. Everyone in Dry River Crossing knew what happened to men who defaulted on debts to Silas Kane. They disappeared, usually leaving behind families too terrified to ask questions about their fate. 25 going twice. Thomas Tully's voice was shrill with panic now. Etta looked at Boone Fletcher's impassive face, then at the letter hidden in her skirts. If she spoke now revealed her condition, no one would bid on her. Her father would die, and she would probably end up in Cain's hands, a fate that would make death from consumption seem merciful by comparison. Sold, her father cried before she could find her voice. The transaction was completed with cold efficiency. Silver coins changed hands, while Etta stood frozen, watching her father count the money that would save his life, while potentially dooming the man who just bought her freedom. As the crowd dispersed and Cain rode away with his payment, Etta found herself alone with Boone Fletcher in the settling dust of the market square. He studied her with those storm-gray eyes, taking in her torn dress, her swollen face, the way she held herself like a cornered animal ready to fight or flee. "You got anything to collect?" he asked. She shook her head, not trusting her voice. Everything she'd owned had been sold or claimed by creditors. The clothes on her back, the hidden letter, and the shame that seemed to permeate her very bones were all that remained of Etta Mae Tully's former life. "Wagons this way," he said, turning without another word. As they rode through the outskirts of town, Etta caught glimpses of her shattered past. The church where she'd prayed desperately for children. The doctor's office where she'd endured examination after humiliating examination. The house where she'd lived with Fergus until his family's patience with her barrenness had finally run out. "My place is rough," Boone said as they bounced over the rutted road. "Lost my wife to childbirth fever 3 winters back. Got 4 young ones ranging from 6 to 15. They're—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "They're difficult. Suspicious of strangers. Last woman I hired to help lasted 2 weeks before she ran off in the night." Etta found her voice for the first time since the auction. "I won't run." The words came out as a whisper, but they carried the weight of absolute truth. She had nowhere to run to, and possibly not enough time left to make running worthwhile. "You're good," he said simply. "Because those children have been hurt enough by people leaving." The Fletcher Ranch materialized gradually through the heat shimmer, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a yard, beaten hard by wind and use. The main house was 2 stories of unpainted wood, its roof patched with whatever materials had been available. A windmill creaked rhythmically in the distance, and the corrals held perhaps 30 head of cattle, their ribs showing despite the sparse grass. But it was the 4 figures that emerged from various corners of the property that made Etta's breath catch. They moved with the wariness of wild creatures studying her, with eyes that had learned too young not to trust easily. The oldest was a girl of perhaps 15, her dark hair braided severely back, and her face marked by premature seriousness. The boys ranged from what looked like 13 down to 6, and all of them carried themselves with the tense alertness of children who'd been forced to grow up too fast. "Children," Boone said as he helped Etta down from the wagon. "This is Miss Etta. She'll be staying with us for a while." The oldest girl, Sarah, Etta would learn, looked her up and down with calculating eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. "Another charity case, Pa. Like the last one who stole Mama's jewelry before she ran off. Sarah." Boone's voice carried a warning, but also a weariness that spoke of having this conversation too many times before. "I'm just saying." Sarah continued, her young voice sharp with old hurt. "Maybe we should ask Miss Etta what she's running from before we let her into our house." The directness of the question caught Etta off guard. These children had clearly learned to protect themselves by asking the questions adults were too polite to voice. She looked around at their suspicious faces and made a decision that surprised her with its honesty. "I'm not running from anything," she said quietly. "I'm running out of time." The cryptic response seemed to intrigue rather than satisfy them, but before any of them could ask for clarification, the youngest boy stepped forward. He was perhaps 6 years old with enormous dark eyes and the thumb firmly planted in his mouth despite his age. "Are you sick?" he asked around his thumb with the brutal directness that only children possessed. Etta felt her throat close. out of the mouths of babes. "A little," she admitted. "Mama was sick too," the boy continued matter-of-factly. "She died." The simple statement hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Etta saw Boone's jaw tighten, saw the other children's faces close off, in the way that spoke of old pain, carefully controlled. "Tommy," Sarah said sharply. "That's enough." But Tommy continued to study Etta with those enormous eyes, as if trying to decode some mystery only he could see. "Are you going to die too?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She looked at this small boy who'd already lost his mother, at the other children who'd clearly been disappointed by adult promises before, and at the man who'd just spent good money on what might turn out to be another heartbreak for his family. "I don't know," she said finally, and the honesty of it seemed to satisfy Tommy in a way that false reassurance wouldn't have. "Come on then," Boone said, hefting her meager bundle. "I'll show you where you'll sleep." The house bore the scars of masculine neglect, and children left too much to their own devices. The parlor held furniture that had once been fine, but now showed the marks of hard use and insufficient care. A woman's touch was still visible in the faded curtains and the dried wildflowers arranged in a mason jar on the mantel. But it was the ghost touch of someone long gone. "You'll have the small room upstairs," Boone said, leading her up steps that creaked ominously under their weight. It was meant to be a nursery. The words explained the room's sad emptiness, the space where dreams of more children had died, along with the woman who'd carried them. Someone had made an effort to make it welcoming, with a patchwork quilt and a small mirror. But it felt like a shrine to hopes that would never be fulfilled. "Children will expect supper around 6, Boone said from the doorway. "Kitchen's got what you need, more or less. Fair warning, they're not used to women's cooking anymore. Might take some adjusting." After he left, Etta sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pulled out the physician's letter, reading again the words that had sealed her fate. Consumption in its early stages, the doctor had written. Perhaps 2 years, maybe less, depending on care and constitution. She should tell Boone Fletcher the truth, should give him the chance to send her away, before his children became attached to another woman, destined to leave them. But as evening approached and she ventured downstairs to attempt her first meal in the Fletcher household, she found herself surrounded by a different kind of challenge than she'd expected. The kitchen was a battlefield of good intentions and poor execution. Pots and pans hung from hooks, but most showed the black scars of burned meals and culinary disasters. The pantry held basics: flour that had seen better days, beans that looked like they'd been stored since the previous century, and some preserved meat of questionable vintage. As she worked trying to create something edible from the available ingredients, Etta became aware that she was being watched. Tommy stood in the doorway, thumb still planted firmly in his mouth, studying her with the intensity of someone memorizing a potentially important lesson. "You hungry, little man?" she asked softly. He nodded but didn't move closer. "What did you like to eat when your mama was alive?" The thumb came out long enough for him to whisper, "Biscuits." She made biscuits that tasted like clouds. The words hit Etta like a punch to the chest. This child still carried the memory of his mother's love in the simple recollection of biscuits that tasted like clouds. She knelt down to his level, ignoring the protest from her knees and the tightness in her chest that might have been emotion or the early symptoms of her condition. "I can try to make biscuits," she said. "Would you like that?" Another nod, and this time he stepped into the kitchen, curiosity overcoming caution. As Etta worked, Tommy became her shadow, watching every move with the intensity of someone memorizing a sacred ritual. The other children drifted in, one by one, first Ben, the 8-year-old, with serious eyes and careful movements. Then Marcus, at 10, already showing signs of the height he'd inherit from his father. And finally Sarah, still wearing her armor of suspicion, but clearly curious about the woman attempting to feed them. When Boone came in from his evening chores, he found his family gathered around the kitchen table for the first time in months, sharing a meal that, while simple, was at least edible. Etta had managed biscuits that were only slightly lopsided, beans that weren't burned, and coffee that didn't taste like mud. "It's good," Tommy announced around a mouthful of biscuit, and Etta felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen, though whether it was emotion or her disease she couldn't tell. Sarah said nothing, but she cleaned her plate and didn't refuse seconds when offered. As the evening wore on and the children were sent to bed, Etta found herself alone with Boone in the kitchen, cleaning up the remnants of the meal. The silence between them was companionable, rather than strained the quiet of two tired people who'd managed to get through another day without disaster. "They lost their mother sudden," he said finally, his hands busy with a dish towel. "Childbirth fever took her in 2 days. Sarah's been trying to be the woman of the house ever since, but she's still just a child herself." "And you?" Etta asked quietly. "What did you lose?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. "Everything that made this place feel like a home, instead of just a place to survive." Etta nodded, understanding that grief intimately. She'd lost her own sense of home when Fergus's family cast her out, though her loss was different, less tragedy than slow humiliation, less death than gradual abandonment. "I won't make promises I can't keep," she said carefully. "But I'll try to help make it feel like home again for whatever time I have." The last phrase slipped out before she could stop it, and she saw Boone's sharp look. But he didn't pursue the comment, perhaps recognizing that everyone carried secrets they weren't ready to share. "That's all any of us can do," he said. "Try." But as Etta settled into her narrow bed that night, listening to the house creak around her and the distant howl of coyotes, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was living a lie. These people deserved to know what they were getting. Not just a barren woman, but a dying one. Tomorrow, she promised herself. Tomorrow she would find the courage to tell them the truth. She had no way of knowing that by tomorrow, the truth would be the least of their problems. The morning brought the first real test of her resolve, arriving in the form of a dust storm that turned day to night and sent the family scrambling for shelter. But it was what the storm revealed when it passed that changed everything. As they emerged from the house, coughing and shaking dust from their clothes, Sarah pointed toward the eastern pasture with a face gone white with shock. "Pa," she said, her young voice tight with fear. "The cattle." Boone followed her gaze and cursed under his breath. Half his herd lay dead in the pasture, not from the storm, but from something far more sinister. The animals showed signs of poison foam around their mouths, the twisted postures of creatures that had died in agony. "Who would do this?" Marcus asked, his 10-year-old voice cracking with the effort not to cry. But Etta was already putting the pieces together, remembering the pale eyes of Silas Kane and the way he'd looked at the Fletcher ranch as he'd ridden away from the auction. This wasn't random vandalism. This was a message. "Mr. Fletcher," she said quietly, "I think this might be my fault." He turned to her with those storm-gray eyes, and she saw in them the same dangerous stillness she'd glimpsed in the market square. "Explain." So she did, telling him about Kane's threats, about her father's debts, about the way the loan shark had studied the Fletcher property, with the calculating gaze of a man already planning to claim it. She watched Boone's face grow progressively darker as the implications became clear. "You think Kane poisoned my cattle to get at you? I think he poisoned your cattle to get at this ranch," Etta said. "My father's debt was just the opening he needed. Now he'll wait for you to fail, then offer to buy the land for a fraction of its worth. When you refuse, he'll find other ways to pressure you." "Like what?" The question was barely out of his mouth when they heard the sound of approaching riders. Kane himself led the group, his pale eyes bright with satisfaction as he surveyed the dead cattle scattered across the pasture. "Nah's terrible shame about your livestock, Fletcher," he called out, not bothering to dismount. "Looks like you've had some bad luck." "Bad luck that smells like strychnine," Boone replied, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. Kane's smile was cold as winter wind. Now that's a serious accusation. You got any proof to back it up? Don't need proof. Just suspicion and a good memory of what happens to people who cross you. But careful, Fletcher. Words like that could be considered threats. Kane's men shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. Speaking of threats, I've been thinking about our mutual friend Miss Tully here. Seems like harboring her might bring you more trouble than you bargained for. She's under my protection now, Boone said simply. Is she? How interesting. Kane's gaze fixed on Etta with predatory intensity. You know, I've heard some disturbing rumors about Miss Tully's condition. Seems like she might not be quite the bargain you thought you were getting. Etta felt her blood turn to ice. Somehow Kane knew about her consumption. But how the only people who'd seen the physician's report were herself and Dr. Morrison sends his regards. Kane continued reading her expression with obvious pleasure. Interesting reading, that medical report. 2 years, maybe less, he estimates. Makes a man wonder why someone would invest in damaged goods. The revelation hit the Fletcher family like a physical blow. Etta saw Sarah's face crumple with understanding. Saw the boys step instinctively closer to their father. Saw Boone's jaw tighten with what might have been anger or betrayal. Asked now. Kane continued pleasantly. I'm prepared to make you a reasonable offer, Fletcher. You give me the woman she owes a debt to my associate that needs settling, and I'll forget about your accusations regarding my cattle. Hell, I might even help you restock your herd. Call it neighborly generosity. And if I refuse, Kane's smile grew wider. Well, then I suppose we'll see just how much bad luck one ranch can handle. The threat was clear, and everyone in the yard understood it. Kane would destroy the Fletcher ranch piece by piece until Boone either gave up Etta or lost everything trying to protect her. I need time to think about it, Boone said finally. Of course. Take all the time you need. Kane tipped his hat mockingly. But don't take too long. Bad luck has a way of multiplying when you're not careful. After Kane and his men rode away, the Fletcher family stood in their yard, surrounded by dead cattle and the ruins of their livelihood, while Etta faced the wreckage of her carefully constructed deception. 2 years. Sarah asked, her young voice breaking. You're really dying. I'm sorry, Etta whispered. I should have told you. I wanted to, but you lied instead. Boone's voice was flat emotionless. Just like everyone else who's come through here. It wasn't like that. Wasn't it, you let me buy you knowing you were damaged goods? Let my children start caring about you knowing you'd be dead before they were grown. The accusation hit her like a physical blow, all the more painful because it was essentially true. She had deceived them, had let them begin to care for her, while hiding the truth about her condition. But Tommy said suddenly, his small voice cutting through the adult anger like a knife. Is Miss Etta going to die like Mama? The question hung in the air like smoke, and Etta saw the moment when Boone's anger crumbled in the face of his youngest son's fear. The man who'd seemed so strong, so capable of handling any crisis, suddenly looked older than his years. I don't know, son, he said quietly. I don't know anything anymore. That night, as the family sat around the dinner table in subdued silence, Etta made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. She couldn't undo her deception, couldn't take back the harm her presence had brought to this family. But she could remove herself before the damage became irreparable. I'll go with Kane, she announced quietly. The reaction was immediate and explosive. No, Sarah said fiercely. You can't. That man's a killer. Marcus added, his young face pale with fear. Everyone knows what happens to people who owe him money. Maybe that's what I deserve, Etta replied. Maybe it's better than slowly dying while you all watch. That's the most selfish thing I've ever heard. Sarah snapped, her 15-year-old indignation burning bright. You think it's easier for us if you get murdered than if you get sick. You think we care less about you because you're dying." The words hit Etta like a revelation. In all her guilt about deceiving them, she'd forgotten that they might actually want her to stay despite her condition, that love didn't always calculate the cost before deciding what was worthwhile. "I don't want you to go," Tommy said, simply climbing into her lap with the complete trust that only children could offer. "I want you to stay and make biscuits until you can't anymore." "And then what?" Etta asked, her throat tight with unshed tears. "Then we'll take care of you like you took care of us," the boy replied, with a matter-of-fact wisdom that sometimes came from the mouths of babes. Boone had been silent through the entire exchange, but now he looked up from his untouched plate with an expression that was hard to read. "Kane's not getting you," he said simply. "Whatever else happens, that's not happening. Even though I lied to you, even though you lied to me." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Though I'd appreciate the truth from now on, whatever time we have left." The next few days passed in an atmosphere of tense preparation. Boone sent word to neighboring ranchers, calling in favors and building alliances for the confrontation that seemed inevitable. Sarah took charge of the younger children with a fierceness that made her seem older than her 15 years. And Etta threw herself into the domestic tasks that gave her purpose, cooking and cleaning and mending with the desperate energy of someone trying to prove her worth before it was too late. But it was Marcus who brought them the news that changed everything. The 10-year-old came racing into the yard on the afternoon of the third day, his face flushed with excitement and fear. "Pup," he called out. "Riders coming, a lot of them." Boone emerged from the barn, his rifle already in his hands. "Kane, no Pa. It's different riders, and they're flying a flag." The flag turned out to be a white cloth, tied to a stick, the universal symbol of parley. But it was the identity of the riders that made Etta's blood run cold. Fergus Voss rode at the head of the group, his once handsome face now marked by the dissipation of a man who'd found no satisfaction in getting everything he'd thought he wanted. Behind him rode a dozen men ranch hands, by the look of them, but armed and ready for trouble. But it was the woman riding beside Fergus who made Etta's knees go weak. Lucinda Voss was no longer the blooming pregnant wife she'd been during their last encounter. Instead, she was thin to the point of gauntness, her face marked by the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd suffered a profound loss. "Hello, Etta," Fergus called out as the group pulled up in the Fletcher yard. "You're looking well considering your circumstances." "What do you want, Fergus?" Boone asked, his rifle held ready but not yet aimed. "I want to make you an offer, Fletcher. A proposition that could solve both our problems." "I'm listening." Fergus dismounted with theatrical grace, but Etta could see the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of either fear or drink. "You see, my wife and I have had some difficulties since our marriage. Turns out the child she was carrying wasn't quite the blessing we'd hoped for." Lucinda's face crumpled at the reminder, and Etta felt a stab of unexpected sympathy for the woman who'd once been her rival. "The baby died," Fergus continued with casual cruelty. "Stillborn. And apparently the damage was severe enough that there won't be any others. Ironic, isn't it? I divorced Etta for being barren, only to marry another woman with the same limitation." "Get to the point," Boone said coldly. "The point, Fletcher, is that I've learned some interesting things about your Miss Etta since our last meeting. Did you know, for instance, that she's not actually my former wife?" The words hit the yard like a thunderbolt. Etta felt the world shift beneath her feet as Fergus continued with obvious satisfaction. "Oh, we went through a ceremony, certainly. Said the pretty words, signed the papers. But it turns out the preacher who married us wasn't actually ordained. Hadn't been for 3 years, ever since the church discovered his fondness for whiskey and gambling. Which means my marriage to Etta was never legal. Which means she's been free this whole time." The revelation should have been liberating. But Etta could see the trap closing around them. Fergus hadn't come here to set her free. He'd come to destroy her in some new and more creative way. Fascinating as that is, Boone said, I still don't see what you want. What I want, Fletcher, is justice. You see, if Etta was never legally my wife, then she has no claim to the property settlement my family gave her when we parted ways. Which means she owes us quite a substantial sum of money. What property settlement? Etta asked, finding her voice. Your family threw me out with nothing but the clothes on my back. Ah, but there was the matter of your father's debt that we assumed as part of the marriage contract. $2,500 plus interest. Since the marriage was invalid, that debt reverts to you personally. The sum was staggering more money than a ranch hand might see in 10 years, but it was Lucinda who delivered the killing blow. We've sold that debt to Mr. Kane. She said, her voice hollow with old pain. He's very eager to collect. The pieces of the trap finally became clear. Kane and Fergus had been working together all along, using the invalid marriage as leverage to claim Etta legally, while destroying the Fletcher ranch as punishment for Boone's defiance. Of course, Fergus continued pleasantly. We're not unreasonable people. We're prepared to forgive the debt in exchange for considerations. What kind of considerations? Boone asked, though Etta could see he already knew. The woman, naturally. And this ranch is compensation for the trouble she's caused us. Don't worry, we'll allow you and the children to relocate peacefully. There are opportunities in California for a man willing to start over. The offer was designed to seem reasonable, almost generous. But Etta could see the malice behind it, the carefully planned destruction of everything the Fletcher family had built. And if we refuse, Boone asked. Fergus smiled, and for the first time, Etta saw the true depth of his hatred for her. Then Mr. Kane will collect his debt through whatever means he finds necessary. I understand he's quite creative when it comes to motivation. The threat was clear, and everyone in the yard understood it. Kane would use Etta's debt as justification to destroy the Fletcher family piece by piece, legally and brutally. I need time to consider your offer, Boone said finally. Of course. You have until tomorrow at noon. After that. Fergus shrugged eloquently. Well, after that the matter will be out of our hands. As the riders departed, leaving behind only dust and the promise of violence, Etta felt the familiar sensation of everything she'd tried to build crumbling around her. But this time was different. This time she wasn't alone. I will fight them, Sarah said fiercely, echoing her father's earlier promise. With what? Marcus asked, his young pragmatism cutting through the bravado. We've got one rifle and a handful of bullets against a dozen armed men. We've got something they don't, Tommy said with the simple wisdom that sometimes came from the mouths of babes. We've got each other. The boy's faith was touching. But Etta could see the calculation in Boone's eyes as he weighed their options. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy with the law on his side. The smart thing to do would be to cut their losses and run. But as the evening wore on and the family gathered around the dinner table one more time, Etta realized that she'd finally found something worth fighting for, even if the fight was hopeless. There's something else you all should know, she said quietly, pulling the physician's letter from her pocket and laying it on the table. About my condition. She told them everything then, about the consumption, about the limited time she had left, about the way the disease would progress. She watched their faces as they absorbed the truth, saw the fear and sadness, but also the stubborn determination that seemed to be a Fletcher family trait. So what do we do? Sarah asked when Etta had finished. We make the time count, Boone said simply. However long we have, we make it count. The attack came at dawn, not at noon as promised. Kane's men struck like a summer storm, sudden and devastating, setting fire to the barn, and driving off what remained of the cattle while the family was still struggling to wake up. But Boone had been expecting treachery, and his preparations saved their lives. The children had been moved to the root cellar during the night, while he and Etta took positions in the house with whatever weapons they could find. The battle was brief, but vicious, a desperate defense against overwhelming odds. Etta found herself crouched behind an overturned table, firing her father's old pistol at shadows in the smoke, while Boone moved through the house like an avenging angel, his rifle speaking with deadly accuracy. When the shooting finally stopped, 3 of Kane's men lay dead in the yard. But the barn was gone, and the house was riddled with bullet holes. Kane himself had escaped along with Fergus and most of their forces, but the message was clear: surrender or face total destruction. "Is everyone all right?" Boone called out as the smoke began to clear. The children emerged from the root cellar, shaken but unharmed. Sarah immediately began checking everyone for injuries, while the boys stared at the destruction with the wide-eyed shock of children who just learned that the world was more dangerous than they'd imagined. But it was Tommy who noticed what the adults had missed in the chaos of battle. "Mama Etta," he said quietly, tugging at her smoke-stained skirt. "You're bleeding." She looked down and saw the spreading red stain on her dress, felt the warm wetness that she'd mistaken for sweat in the heat of battle. A stray bullet had found its mark, and she was bleeding more than a surface wound should account for. "It's not bad," she said quickly, not wanting to frighten the children. But Boone was already there, his experienced hands probing the wound with gentle efficiency. His face went pale as his fingers found the exit wound, and she saw in his eyes the knowledge they both shared: the bullet had done more than pierce flesh. It had accelerated the disease, already eating at her lungs, probably cutting her remaining time from years to months, maybe weeks. "How long?" she whispered so quietly that only he could hear. "I don't know," he replied just as softly. "But we're not giving up. Not on you, not on us, not on anything." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Neighbors began arriving, ranchers who'd heard the gunfire and come to investigate, women who brought medical supplies, and food men who offered weapons and ammunition for the fight that everyone knew was coming. But it was the arrival of Judge Morrison that changed the dynamics of the conflict entirely. The territorial judge rode in with a federal marshal and a dozen armed deputies, his face grim with the authority of law and order. He surveyed the damage with professional detachment and then called for all parties to assemble for an impromptu hearing. "Isor, this situation has gone far enough," he announced to the crowd that had gathered in the Fletcher yard. "We're going to settle this matter according to law, not gunfire." Fergus and Kane arrived within the hour, their forces augmented by more hired guns and their confidence bolstered by the legal documents they carried. They clearly expected the judge's intervention to work in their favor, giving them official sanction for their claims against Etta and the Fletcher ranch. "Your Honor," Fergus began with practiced smoothness, "we're here to collect a legitimate debt from Miss Tully, who has been living unlawfully with Mr. Fletcher and corrupting his children with her presence." "Is that so?" Judge Morrison replied dryly. "And what exactly is the nature of this debt?" As Fergus launched into his carefully prepared explanation about the invalid marriage and assumed obligations, Etta felt a strange calm settle over her. The bleeding had slowed, but she could feel her strength ebbing with each passing minute. If she was going to make a stand, it had to be now. "Your Honor," she interrupted, her voice carrying despite its weakness, "I'd like to tell you the real story." "Miss Tully, you're in no condition?" The judge began, noting her pale complexion and the blood staining her dress. "I'm in exactly the condition I need to be in," she replied firmly. "For the first time in years, I'm exactly where I need to be." She told them everything then, not just the facts about her marriage and debt, but the whole truth about what had brought her to this point. She spoke about being sold like livestock by her own father, about the years of abuse and humiliation she'd endured with Fergus, about finding love and purpose with a family that had accepted her despite her flaws. Mr. Voss claims I owe him money for a debt he assumed during our marriage. She said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. But he's never mentioned the money he owes me for 4 years of unpaid labor for the inheritance from my mother that his family stole for the businesses I helped build with my own hands before barrenness made me worthless to them. That's ridiculous, Fergus began, but Judge Morrison silenced him with a gesture. Continue, Miss Tully. More than that, Your Honor, Mr. Voss and Mr. Kane have been working together to drive the Fletcher family off their land through intimidation and violence. The poisoned cattle the dawn attacked, the threats against children. This isn't about debt collection. This is about theft, pure and simple. You have proof of these allegations? The judge asked. It was Sarah who stepped forward, her young face set with determination. I have proof, Your Honor. She produced a small leather journal, its pages filled with careful handwriting and detailed observations. I've been keeping records ever since the first cattle died. Times, dates, witnesses, everything. The journal was a revelation documenting not just the recent attacks, but a pattern of harassment and intimidation that stretched back months. Sarah had been watching and recording, building a legal case with the methodical precision of someone who understood that justice required evidence, not just anger. As Judge Morrison reviewed the documentation, his expression grew progressively darker. Mr. Kane, these are serious allegations. Do you have any response? Kane's confident facade began to crack. The girl's lying. Children will say anything to protect. The girl's 15 years old and has better handwriting than most of my court clerks. Judge Morrison interrupted. Her observations are detailed, consistent, and corroborated by multiple witnesses. Unless you have evidence to the contrary, I'm inclined to believe her account. Your Honor, the federal marshal interjected. We've been investigating reports of cattle poisoning and property destruction in this area for weeks. This documentation could be exactly what we need to make arrests. The tide was turning, but Etta could see desperation building in Kane's pale eyes. Desperate men were dangerous men, especially when they had nothing left to lose. This is all very interesting, Kane said with forced calm, but it doesn't change the fundamental facts. The woman owes money that I'm legally entitled to collect. If she can't pay, then I'll take what's owed from her assets, including any claim she might have on Fletcher property. What claim would that be? Judge Morrison asked. Well, she's been living as his common-law wife, hasn't she? Acting as mother to his children, sharing his bed. That's a lie, Boone said quietly, but his voice carried across the yard like thunder. Miss Etta has been a guest in my house, helping with domestic duties in exchange for room and board. Nothing more. A convenient fiction, Kane sneered, but hardly credible. A man doesn't risk his life and property for a mere housekeeper. No, Boone agreed. He doesn't. The admission sent a ripple of surprise through the crowd. Etta felt her heart stop as she realized what Boone was about to do. He risks it for his wife. Boone continued, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. Judge Morrison, I'd like you to witness a marriage contract. The document was simple but legal, a binding agreement between Boone Fletcher and Etta Mae Tully, dated that morning and signed by both parties. It wasn't a romantic proposal or a declaration of undying love. It was a strategic alliance, a legal shield designed to protect both the woman and the family that had become precious to him. When was this signed? Judge Morrison asked, examining the paper with professional interest. This morning before the attack. We wanted to make sure our legal standing was clear before things got complicated. It was a masterful piece of legal maneuvering, transforming Etta from a vulnerable debtor into a protected spouse with legitimate claims on Fletcher property. But more than that, it was a public declaration that the Fletcher family considered her one of their own, worth fighting for regardless of the cost. Kane's face went white with rage. "This is fraud conspiracy. You can't just marry your way out of a legal debt." "Actually," Judge Morrison said mildly, "territorial law is quite clear on this point. Marriage creates a legal partnership that includes shared assets and shared debts. If Miss Tully, Mrs. Fletcher, owes money, then her husband shares that obligation. But he also shares any claims she might have against creditors who have treated her illegally. Which brings us to an interesting question," the federal marshal added. "Mrs. Fletcher, do you wish to press charges against Mr. Voss and Mr. Kane for assault, battery, property destruction, and attempted extortion?" Etta looked around the yard at the faces surrounding her. The children who'd called her Mama the Man, who'd just made her his wife, the neighbors who'd come to their aid. She thought about the years of abuse and humiliation she'd endured, about the fear and shame that had defined her existence for so long. "Yes," she said simply, "I do." The arrests happened quickly after that. Kane and several of his men were taken into custody, their weapons confiscated, and their threats rendered impotent by the authority of federal law. Fergus tried to claim diplomatic immunity as a legitimate businessman, but the evidence in Sarah's journal was too detailed and damning to ignore. As the prisoners were loaded into wagons and the crowd began to disperse, Etta found herself alone with her new husband and his children, her children now legally and emotionally. "Are you really married to Pa now?" Tommy asked his 6-year-old mind, struggling to process the rapid changes in his world. "If you want me to be," Etta replied softly. "I want you to be," he said firmly, "forever and ever. Even if I get sicker, even if I can't take care of you the way a real mother should." Tommy considered this with the gravity that small children brought to important questions. "You'll take care of us as much as you can," he said finally. "And when you can't, we'll take care of you. That's what families do." The simple wisdom of it brought tears to Etta's eyes. This child had already lost one mother to disease, but he was willing to risk that pain again for the chance to love and be loved in return. "Mrs. Fletcher," Boone said quietly, testing the name on his tongue. "How does that sound?" "Like something I never thought I'd hear," she admitted. "Like something I never thought I deserved." "You deserve it," Sarah said fiercely, appearing at her elbow with the sudden loyalty that teenagers could display when their emotions were engaged. "You deserve all of it." As the weeks that followed turned into months, the Fletcher Ranch slowly rebuilt itself from the ashes of destruction. The barn was raised again with help from neighbors, and the cattle herd was restocked with donations and careful purchases, and the bullet holes in the house were patched and painted over. But it was the changes in the family itself that proved most remarkable. Etta's condition, rather than creating distance, seemed to bring them all closer together. The children took turns reading to her. When coughing fits left her breathless, Sarah learned advanced cooking techniques to tempt her diminished appetite. And Boone carved a rocking chair where she could sit in the evening and watch the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. The adoption of Grace came about almost by accident. The little girl appeared at their door one autumn morning, orphaned by influenza and facing the grim prospect of the territorial orphanage. She was 4 years old, thin and frightened, but trying desperately to be brave. And the moment Etta saw her, she knew they were meant to be together. "Can we keep her?" Tommy asked with a directness that only children possessed. "She needs a family, and we need someone littler than me to take care of." "What do you think, Mrs. Fletcher?" Boone asked, using the formal address that had become a kind of endearment between them. "Do we have room for one more?" Etta looked around at the faces of her family, the children who'd accepted her despite her flaws, the man who'd married her despite her condition, and the little girl who needed love more than she needed guarantees about the future. "We have room," she said simply. "We always have room." The legal proceedings to finalize Grace's adoption took place the following spring on a day when Etta felt strong enough to make the journey to town. Judge Morrison presided over the ceremony with the same dignity he'd brought to their crisis the year before. And the entire Fletcher family was present to witness the moment when Grace officially became their daughter and sister. "Do you promise to love and care for this child as if she were your own?" the judge asked, following the ritual questions that made adoptions legal. "She is our own." Etta replied, her voice clear and strong, despite the persistent cough that now marked her days. "She always has been." As they emerged from the courthouse into the bright spring sunshine, Grace tugging at Etta's skirts and chattering about everything she wanted to show her new mama, Etta reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd started as a woman branded barren and worthless, sold like livestock in a market square. She'd been accused of adultery and moral corruption, threatened with exile and death. She'd lived with the knowledge that her time was limited, that the disease in her lungs would eventually claim her, regardless of how much love surrounded her. But she'd also learned that barrenness was just a medical condition, not a judgment on her worth as a human being. She'd discovered that family could be built from choice, rather than blood, that love could triumph over any obstacle if people were willing to fight for it. Most importantly, she'd found her place in the world not as someone's discarded wife or someone's charitable burden, but as the cornerstone of a family that had been built from the wreckage of loss and the stubborn insistence that tomorrow could be better than today. The consumption would take her eventually, probably sooner rather than later. But when that time came, she would leave behind 5 children who knew they were loved, a husband who had learned to trust again, and a ranch that had become a refuge for anyone who needed shelter from the storms of life. Standing in the courthouse square with her family gathered around her, watching Grace chase butterflies, while the older children planned improvements to the ranch, and Boone discussed cattle prices with neighbors who had become friends, Etta Mae Fletcher finally understood what her mother had tried to tell her years ago. Love was the only currency that mattered, and she was rich beyond measure. That evening, as she sat in her rocking chair on the front porch, watching the sun set over the prairie that had become her home, Boone joined her with 2 cups of coffee and the satisfied expression of a man whose day's work was done. "Any regrets?" he asked, echoing the question he'd posed on their wedding night. Etta leaned against his solid warmth, listening to the sounds of her children playing in the yard, feeling the gentle movement of the baby. Grace was cradling not her biological child, but hers in every way that mattered. "None," she said firmly, and meant it completely. "Not a single one." The wind swept across the prairie with its eternal song of freedom and possibility, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of tomorrow. In the distance, coyotes called to each other across the vast darkness, their voices no longer seeming like threats, but like old friends welcoming the night. Etta Mae Fletcher closed her eyes and listened to the symphony of her life, the steady breathing of her husband beside her, the whispered dreams of children who called her mama, the gentle creak of a house that had become a home through nothing more miraculous than love and stubborn determination. She had been sold like livestock, branded as worthless and nearly destroyed by the cruelty of small minds and smaller hearts. But she had also been redeemed by the faith of 4 orphan children, the quiet strength of a man who understood that family was something you built rather than something you were born into, and the radical notion that a woman's worth wasn't measured by what she could produce, but by what she could nurture and protect. In the morning, there would be breakfast to make and clothes to mend, and the 1,000 small tasks that made up the fabric of daily life. Sarah would continue preparing for her own wedding, the boys would argue about chores, Grace would chatter about her dolls and her dreams, and Boone would head out to tend the cattle that had made their ranch prosperous again. It would be an ordinary day in an ordinary life, and it would be perfect precisely because of its ordinariness, because she had earned the right to ordinary happiness through extraordinary trials. As sleep began to claim her, Etta thought about the name carved on the garden archway Boone had built the previous summer. Not the name she'd been born with, or the one she'd taken in a marriage of convenience, but the name she'd chosen for herself through love and sacrifice. and the radical act of refusing to give up hope. Etta Mae Fletcher, wife, mother, woman who had learned that the heart's capacity for love was infinite, and that barrenness was only a medical condition, not a judgment on the soul. She had found her family, and they had found her. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. The consumption might claim her body, but it could never touch what she'd built with these people who'd chosen to love her, despite all the reasons they had not to. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, telling stories of triumph and loss of love found and love lost of ordinary people who did extraordinary things simply because someone they cared about needed them to try. And on a small ranch in the middle of nowhere, a woman who'd been told she was worthless discovered that she was in fact priceless. Not for what she could give, but for what she could inspire others to become. Etta Mae Fletcher had found her home at last, and it was everything she'd never dared to dream it could be.